Hello and welcome to Contact Center Showcase and Lessons from the Lockdown. And today my very special guest all the way from London in the UK is Dave Rumble. And I see it's very sunny and all green outside your office window there. Dave, welcome.
Oh, hi. Yeah. Hi, Rod. Yeah. Thank you very much for asking me to support this great initiative. Yeah. I think the weather has obviously turned in the UK, which is nice, particularly when we can't go very far in the UK. So it's nice to look out on some sunshine.
Excellent. Nice to have you with us. And for those of you who don't know Dave, Dave and I go back a good few years. Dave is recognized internationally as a thought leader in the space of CX strategy, transformation, digitisation, and strategic advisor in the space, advising specifically into those areas, and recognized throughout, I think, the world, the BPO world, as a thought leader in BPO and global business services. Dave's also the managing partner of On Consulting, or OC. And so, Dave, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm going to fire into it straight away. I would really appreciate your views on how you saw the global BPO, GBS industry towards the end of last year, through December, into January. Was the sun shining on the industry? Were you bullish? What was your view of the global sector at that time?
Yeah. Well, I think, 2018, 2019, really quite interesting years for the sector. I think there were certainly high degrees of confidence, particularly on supply side. Industry consolidation, new markets, new opportunities emerging with obviously the introduction of new channels and new technical capabilities that were becoming, I guess, a little bit more cost effective and commoditized. So I think, for me, particularly at the top end of the market and those operating internationally and transnationally, really, really good and high degrees of confidence in, the future health of the sector. And that represented itself in, some big moves around consolidation. So one or two of the bigger suppliers looking to come together, some fairly sizable acquisitions, private equity money coming in, keeping the market liquid. So, you saw from that perspective, even at the bigger levels, that the investment and, the confidence in the sector was very strong, particularly through the back end of 2019. I think one thing that really did stand out, particularly, I think, as a consequence of, the broader macro position around technology, the use of robotics and AI. I think it was fairly common themes started to emerge about rehumanizing BPO. So a lot of the bigger players started to, bring in that, the humanization of customer contact and the humanization of customer experience, and really push that point around the importance of conversation and the importance of the nuances of having the human in that dialogue between.
That's interesting. We're going to dig onto that one a little bit, because I would have anticipated through 2019 into 20 this massive drive for automation and self-service, etc. Now, you've observed something different there. I hadn't come across the humanization aspect.
Well, yeah, I think it doesn't stop. On client side, I think, that drive to find alternative channels to, repatriate value in terms of cost, and looking to advance their business, maybe reduce their cost base, or maybe improve customer experience through opening up new digital channels. So the pursuit of that, omni-channel, whatever we want to call it, multi-channel world with, a combination of highly accessible digital services. I think where those things started to peel away is that customers don't always, or aren't always, ready to accept those channels, whether they're relevant,
right,
they're right for that particular contact. So I think customers, people started, particularly, some of those sectors, financial services, particularly where, the importance of having a conversation and the qualification. So concerns maybe about security, or, the types of questions that I'm going to be asking are, quite personal. So that personalization theme really started to flow through into making sure that that contact is relevant to the individual. So automation has its place, absolutely, and it will undoubtedly have a major impact on the sector. But I think more importantly, the other side is from a supply side perspective, particularly in the GBS and BPO sector, is how the suppliers respond to that and making sure that those customer journeys are effective and, more importantly, connected on a human level. So you can't deliver personalization necessarily without having something in there that's interpersonal, and I think that's where a human contact, not always voice, obviously it can be messaging, it can be it's just a piece of personal correspondence in the form of an email or something like that, but just adding in that extra dimension. And I think there were other sectors as well where humanity, so some of the stuff around content moderation, some of these new areas where people are starting to get a little bit more excited about the interactions that they might be having on kind of whether it's a visual platform or whether it's something to do with obviously some social networks, that the whole interaction and how those are contained, and those bubbles that we're now talking about in the context of COVID, how those are maintained and the integrity of those are maintained. And that's where the human intervention, I think is...
There's a subject for another discussion, which we might pick up in another time. But that correlation between digitisation, self-service, automation, and trust.
Absolutely, I think trust.
Yeah. We'll move on to that one in another session, I'm sure. But then along came late February, early March, the spectre of COVID looming over the world, and then its almost immediate impact on the likes of Philippines, India, and even in South Africa as well. I think 25th of March was our lockdown.
Yeah.
From your viewpoint, having a global view of the GBS industry, what were you seeing in the early stages of the lockdown?
It was a pretty mixed bag, if I'm honest. So I think, as we would see it, kind of at national level, and the representations just out in terms of the wider sectors, I think, one or two suppliers and some parts of the market just said, oh, look, this is just this little thing, it's just going to blow over, what's the risk, Do you know what? We're just going to, we'll carry on, it's fine.
Weather the storm. Mm.
Just weather the storm. It'll just be, it'll be a bit like the financial crisis. There won't be any. And I think it really started. I think the Philippines probably, in terms of the timing and kind of bringing the spread westwards, and you take the kind of the impact. Obviously, the stuff that was going on in China, we're not necessarily as exposed to from the point of view of the international BPO sector. But as soon as the Philippines started, the restrictions started to bear in the Philippines, I think that's when, the market really started to take notice and, well, hang on a second, we're really going to have to work this one through. And then, kind of the move westwards, finishing really in the States, in terms of the whole kind of the process. Each country taking slightly, kind of slightly different approaches to whether it was the physical distancing or whether it's into, some of the more restrictive measures. Obviously, we've got Sweden that have chosen not to do any of those types of things. But, the market, that kind of market shift, there was almost this, kind of underlying, well, look, it doesn't matter. But then really, I think, and this is where I think the BPO sector has done an amazing job, is then into the pace of execution when that realization of, well, hang on a second, this is very serious, and we need to do something about it and get on it. And I think I'd draw two dimensions, and these will ultimately lead to the success and the fate of some of those suppliers who've responded. So there was how quickly the supplier responded. So, and this brings in a number of different dimensions, how they treated their people, what they were doing with their colleagues, what they did from an infrastructure perspective, the investment decisions that they made just around, kind of continuity. So there's this pace point, which is one axis, and then there's the quality of the execution, and getting into, I'm moving stuff outwards and this kind of stuff. So these two dimensions, those two things are really important if you're a BPO. So one, pace gives you the ability to retain revenue, and more importantly, when other opportunities come, which will come as a consequence of, global shifts, that you're able to acquire new revenue, and get new work because new opportunities will come. So I think pace and the agility of an organisation, and some have done very well at doing that. We did a track and looked at that. And then I think the quality and the kind of the substance of the solution in terms of the deployment of service and the deployment of other work from home or work from community hubs and this kind of stuff. The quality of that and the integrity of that will drive the preservation of margin. One is cash, one is margin, and those are the two things at the end of the day.
Interesting model. Yeah.
that will hold up whether an organisation is going to succeed or not. So there were some really interesting things. We did a cast over, particularly UK and some of the European markets, to look at that provider landscape to say, okay, who responded quickly, who did a really good job of responding quickly, and then more importantly, the integrity of what they were offering in their COVID solution. How good was that COVID solution?
Maintaining their CX guys, yeah. Okay.
And it's very apparent those that were able to move more quickly, and very apparent those that that were less fleet of foot, less agile.
It's a fascinating angle that you've put on it now, and I'll expand on that later. But in your area of expertise of digitisation, many of us in the industry have been talking the digitisation, digital migration journey for 10 years. And it's in many cases, I've seen it as those clients putting it on the back burner, that it's something we need to do, but not now. And your observation of how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted on the take-up or the implementation and execution of digitisation?
Well, I think from a client side perspective, it's been pretty frenetic. I think there have been a lot of very hastily rushed in solutions for all the right reasons. So digital deflection, tools that really I wouldn't consider to be that advanced, that will kind of time shift demand, move customers out. Quick and dirty, yeah. So, and those solutions are not really that challenging to implement, i.e. get in, but where they are exceptionally difficult is in managing the consequences and managing the customer journeys associated with those, so that you don't inadvertently push a customer down into a cul-de-sac, or something else isn't happening. If you're a retailer, I can you can give me all of your orders, or you can check your order and we can do all of that digitally. But if your supply chain and the infrastructure isn't working behind it, then what happens? If you're an airline and you can't process, what do I do with the alternative of the refund process? So there's a bunch of things go on in there that say, well, look, I can, at an interaction level, I can deploy those technologies really quickly, and some of them have done really amazing jobs. But I think more importantly underneath that is then I've got this kind of bounce back in other areas of the business, because other parts of my organisation aren't necessarily able to operate the same cadence as the front end. So the interaction issue is dealt with, and it's cool, that's good. But the downstream consequences of that, with the physical inability to deliver products or deliver goods, or process a refund, those kind of things. So I think what it does do is it opens up, I definitely think it opens up for the BPO market and this kind of solutioning consulting opportunity, where you look more deliberately at the extent of a customer journey, not just at the conversational element, but more of the
end-to-end.
End-to-end. And so solutioning around that, I think, is going to become much more relevant. But that early digitization and some of those early waves of, well, we're just going to deploy messaging, we'll just pop into WhatsApp, we'll just do this, I think they're all great. and customers will accept that for a period of time. But what we're going to be doing, inevitably, is there's going to be a massive bounce back.
Well, this is the point I wanted to ask you on, with the view, particularly your view on the UK environment. My observation has been that in the first 3 or 4 weeks or 5 weeks of the early days of lockdown, the customer was very forgiving of work from home aids, etc. But the feedback I'm getting here in South Africa is that their tolerance is now wearing a bit thin, and the expectations are going back to the service delivery that they were receiving in a bricks and mortar environment. But by comparison, how is the UK customer responding to these type of interventions?
Yeah, I think that very similar. We're going to do some work on the analytics around the customer behaviour that goes with this to see what the latent demand is. But I think that a very similar kind of consumer dynamic, which is, well, that we understand there are issues. We understand that you can't put people in call centres, that kind of stuff. So we'll be forgiving. The fact that we can't get through, that we can't check things, again, we'll be maybe a little bit forgiving because we're at home and who cares? We've got some time. I think you're absolutely right. The minute that those I'll call them restrictions are lifted. I was going to say change. Once the chains are off, I think inevitably, customer expectations are going to be shifting very quickly to, hang on a second, I was happy to wait for 30 minutes or 40 minutes or an hour or 2 hours to get through. I'm not prepared to do that now. Yeah. So I think there's this, there's inevitably the kind of the curve almost occasionally will get an uplift. And then I think, and this is something that we definitely need to be worried about in terms of an industry is, mental well-being and all of this kind of stuff. I think customer aggression and customer agitation is definitely going to be much more prevalent in those contacts. So if you're dealing with voice contacts, the level of emotion and sentiment is going to be a bounce back that we just need to make sure that from a people perspective we're addressing.
When we move on towards the end, when we do a wrap, I'm going to ask you to look into that crystal ball.
Yeah.
And let's see what your views are on going forward. What I'd be interested in your position looking at the global GBS BPO industry as a whole. If we take the big players, the India, Philippines, Eastern Europe, Poland, Central America, which of those industries or industry bodies responded, in your opinion, appropriately to the prospect of a total lockdown? We're seeing stuff, and maybe from a prejudice point of view, from a South African perspective, but be interested in your viewpoint from the helicopters level.
There's some really interesting stuff from the point of view of, that collaboration and cooperation at an industry level. I think provider-led versus client-led versus, I'll call it NGO infrastructure-led. I think there are definitely standouts in terms of, what parts of the world have responded more favourably, and some of that is a consequence of scale, and some of that is a consequence of, of the sponsorship of the sector and the profile of the sector in the location. I would have to call out South Africa in terms of the ability to respond and the process through which the industry and the industry bodies went through to put, kind of the appropriate framework in place to make sure that the industry survives in a way that obviously it survives through the period of COVID, respectfully looking after all the colleagues, but more importantly puts the sector and the welfare of the sector in the future in much higher regard than some other parts of the world. And I think that those things will start to work themselves out as clients start to look at locations again, which they inevitably will have to. which parts of the world actually took good care of business and more importantly, good care of people. So I think South Africa, I would say, is a standout. There are other parts of the world that, that have responded well as well, just in terms of, but they tend to be the smaller markets. I'd say, my view is the India market was very supplier led. It was less, and it was almost, I won't call it a free for all, but it seemed to be much more, much more organised and oriented around what the suppliers were able to do and how they were able to do it. And clearly there are some things around the logistics and the infrastructure and all the rest of it that go into, an ability to respond. I think Philippines, with being the first, and we look at them, they were caught off guard, I would say, quite a lot of the stuff there. I think they were one that, it kind of, well, it's not coming to us, and then all of a sudden it was there. So I think probably unfair to penalise them because they were really the guys who were the first ones in it. But I think, the more progressive parts of the world, and I'll count South Africa in that, have done a really, really good job and represented the industry exceptionally well. So I think that will bear fruit into the future.
That's good to hear. And I think that, coupled with the recent announcement through the CXO research that South Africa was placed in.
Yeah, made number 2. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah.
We're very excited about that. And so
really good.
Watch the space going forward.
Well, I have to say, I always look forward to Peter's research, because it's always very good from the point of view. It validates the
gut feeling
we do as well. So it's great.
Now, the last little part here is we gaze into a very murky crystal ball. And what do we see, or what do you see post-COVID, whenever that might be, late 2020 into 21, assuming we're back to some degree of new normal. The impact of COVID on what have we learned as an industry, BPR, GBS, and how do you think that might change the nature of the beast of the industry going forward into the new tomorrow?
Yeah, well, I think as a team, we're spending time looking at this and the effect on, kind of the client side, what happens in the demand side of the market, and then really from a supply side, how does the supply market get ready for, inevitably for the changes in demand. So I think we're starting to see a bunch of themes emerge client side as people are now starting to plot their way out. Clients are starting to plot their way out. So there's a definite mind and theme around looking at, and we'll use the term, kind of quite generically, but hybrid sourcing models. So, much more akin to, well, hang on a second, some organisations, and the Googles, the Facebooks, you're allowed to work from home. Doesn't matter. That's it. Well, how do we address that in our proposition? How do we address the fact that we're going to have to maintain a level of physical distancing in the real estate, and most of the organisations are set up and configured to optimise a property in a location so that the utilisation of the property is high. So I think there's a definite, what are we going to do? Is there a hybrid solution in here with mixes of home, office, and how we manage that? I think another theme is around community. So the notion of a work through, so almost the social hubs. And South Africa did some great stuff here with getting folks working from hotels and creating these kind of notional hubs where you've got a community of work areas. So people come in and go out and have, not hot desking per se, because obviously that brings with it other challenges around hygiene and stuff, but more around an ability to socially connect with colleagues and, leadership and so forth, just in terms of that. So there's a theme really, again, there about kind of decommissioning some of these big, huge buildings and coming down into, much more fleet of foot. And then I think client-side issues, how do I return to trade? So this is a model about flexibility. So how do I bring my business back to life? So if you worked in the travel sector, if you're working in, some parts of the retail sector, if you're in gastro sector, how do I bring my business back to life? And how might I use an outsourcer to help me switch on that demand, potentially generate some revenue? So I think we're going to see that as quite a growth sector, and I think some of the smaller outsourcers will start to emerge with niche capabilities to help organisations return to trade.
That's good news for our industry. I think that.
I think it is, yes. I think there'll be smaller. So some of the bigger transactions that we've seen that that take a long time to come to market. I think there'll be some of these more speculative, and people need to get used to that. Kind of more flexible working where organisations are returning to trade. I think function as a service. A lot of the organisations have been absolutely battered. Their support services, their HR functions, their L&D functions, their forecasting and planning, their MI, the BI. So I think function as a service and a set of managed services, again, will start to emerge, excuse me, as a market opportunity. And I think the most important one is around purpose-led partnering. We saw a lot of this. Hang on a second, where in my contract does it say that I've got an obligation from the supplier or an obligation from the client to continue to work in a situation where there's a pandemic? And a lot of the toing and froing, tension in the partnership, obviously, but those things will dissipate over time inevitably. But I think more importantly, the effect on end customers. How do I give my partner more permissions or greater degree of permission to get on and do stuff for my customers in the context of, I need to spin services up quickly, I need to run them down quickly. So the notion of a framework, rather than having a schedule or an appendix that says, if there's a business continuity event, this is what we do. I think some more, kind of framework and purpose-led propositions that are saying, look, we want you to do this for our customers, we want you to do this, so more values-led. And there's been a lot of talk about that over the time. Simon Sinek talking about, what's our purpose, that kind of stuff. I think contractually and commercially, I think that will start to emerge as a...
In fact, you've answered then what was going to be the next question, which is what lessons has our industry learned out of this? And I think what I'm hearing you saying is that's one of them, is purpose-led.
Well, it's the purpose there, but I think the big fun for me, and I'll come back to that thing I was saying earlier about the ability to move quickly and the quality of the execution. So I think that's one big learning is some organisations, client side and supply side, have been able to respond more quickly. So I think pace and agility, decision making. So I think that's been a big thing. So you can see those organisations and those clients that have suffered from inertia, and then you see the consumer backlash and the stuff that goes through that. So I think that kind of having that kind of dimension in there. So I think from the point of view of demand and future concerns about the industry and the inevitability, and we're going to have this big wave of AI, and we're releasing digital. I still think that that human dimension in conversations. We are a conversational animal. That's what we are. And I think if anything, it does demonstrate that in times of need, whether it's the state that picks it up, we've got a big shift in state support, obviously massive investments in from state to keep people continuing, to kind of exist and function. So I think that kind of people-led and human-led conversation. So I think whether it's digital conversations or whether it's physical voice conversations or whether it's video communications that we're now in, I think people do need to talk. So I think that's become, amplified. And I think the precision of those conversations has become more important. I'm doing video regularly now. We're all having video conference. We're using Zoom, we're using Teams, whatever. Conversations are more intense through this medium. You have to be more attentive. So I think conversation will become more important and people will see that it'll become more important. And I think the last thing, which as an industry, we are duty bound to pick up. There were some organisations, and I won't mention names, but you might have seen on my LinkedIn if it is, that have treated their colleagues and their staff appallingly badly through this process. So I think physical well-being and mental well-being and the bond between client, supplier, but more importantly, between leadership and the front line has never been more important. If we don't get that right as an industry going forward, I think we will start to get ourselves into a position where some of the great stuff that's gone on will get undone. And I do hope that some of these organisations that have treated their colleagues badly do pay for it. Not in a kind of a mealy mouth way, but that consumers don't. But I think mental well-being and physical well-being and the art of humanity, and as an industry, if that's the way we are going to position ourselves, that the human contact, and we're humanising conversations between client organisation and the consumer as a GBS business and the GBS sector, that we live by those values and make sure that we protect our colleagues' health, well-being, and their mental well-being, because I think that's important. And there have been some amazing things that some of the guys have done. I won't shout, won't call them all out, because I'll get pulled up. But there have been some really amazing things and amazing stories that some of the guys have done.
Look forward to reading your postings, both the positive and
yeah.
I think we're going to wrap up now, but Dave Rumble, thank you so much for your inputs here and your insights and your wisdom and your support for the South African industry. Any closing words for, particularly my audience is largely South African. Any closing words from your side of the planet?
Well, I just said be confident. That there's a lot of good stuff going on in the sector. Be confident. Look for those opportunities that aren't necessarily always obvious. But most importantly, and this is the one great thing, as part of the South Africa value proposition, Ubuntu, all of the stuff that sits around real meaning around that human interaction. And I think that's something that, as a part of the South Africa value proposition is really important. So I've got every confidence that South Africa will come out of this in a positive way, and that we can use this as an opportunity to grow the industry even more in South Africa.
Wonderful, great news, and thank you so much for your time. And
thanks, Rod. Yeah, cheers.
Enjoy your summer in your garden.
Yes.
Thanks a million.
Yeah, no problem. Cheers.